When we hear the word Siberia, we most often think of permafrost, endless forests, and freezing cold. But in the Middle Ages, there was a Khanate here with its own capital, army, dynasty, and even diplomacy. Its rulers made alliances with Moscow and Kazan, fought with their neighbors, and controlled trade routes deep into Asia. It was a state on the border of the taiga and the steppe, where nomadic life was combined with a settled way of living. It is rarely mentioned in textbooks, even though it played an important role in the fate of the region. The history of the Siberian Khanate is a story about how a distant frontier was actually at the center of the political struggle of its time. Welcome to the Amazing History channel, where we talk about forgotten states and people who influenced the fate of entire regions. Today's topic came about thanks to your comments. You often asked us to talk about the Siberian Khanate, and we decided to do it. Special thanks to our channel sponsors, because it's your support that allows us to prepare such large and complex materials. Thank you for staying with us and helping to bring history to life. The Siberian Khanate's history is closely tied to the Taibugid dynasty, which began with Taibuga. He was a Turkic leader in the Irtysh region during the 13th century as the Golden Horde was forming. Turkic and Ugric tribes already lived in western Siberia then. The Chinggisid's influence here was mostly through military campaigns and tribute collection, not lasting control. Taibuga united local forces and established stable authority in the territory. Unlike the Chinggisids, Taibuga did not have the legal right to the Khan's title, but in the steppe, the right of strength was valued no less than lineage. His descendants managed to gain a foothold in the area of Tyumen and Chingitura, the first centers around which the local state began to form. They owned lands along the Irtysh and Ishim rivers, controlled caravans and routes from Central Asia to Siberia, and collected tribute from the local tribes. The peculiarity of Taibuga's rule was that they combined two traditions. On one hand, they were a steppe elite with nomadic customs, herds, military squads, and campaigns. On the other hand, they actively interacted with the neighboring population, Ugric farmers, fishermen, and urban craftsmen. Thus, a mixed model of power emerged, which could rely both on the nomadic camps and on the city. The Taibugid dynasty was the first local power in western Siberia. Their Khanate did not become independent right away. At first, they recognized the supremacy of the Golden Horde and later maneuvered between powerful neighbors. But it was Taibuga and his descendants who laid the foundation for the political entity that would later become known as the Siberian Khanate. Every state has a symbol, a city around which it is built. For the Siberian Khanate, such symbols were Chingitura and Kashlik. Chingitura became the first center. It was not just a fortress city, but a crossroads of roads. Trade routes from Central Asia, the Urals, and the depths of Siberia converged here. Chingitura stood at the edge of the forest and steppe, allowing control over both nomads and settled tribes. Merchants, craftsmen, Tatars, and Ugric people lived in the city, and it was here that one could see how the nomadic nobility gradually adopted elements of settled culture, built fortifications, kept written records, and minted coins. But the time of Chingitura was short-lived. In the 15th century, the center shifted to Kashlik, or Isker, which stood on the high bank of the Irtysh River. Kashlik became the true capital of the Khanate. It was larger, richer, and easier to defend. Tribute from the subordinate tribes flowed here, caravans arrived here, alliances were made here, and disputes were settled here. Archaeologists discover Eastern ceramics, weapons, and Central Asian coins in Kashlik, a city once thriving on international trade. But let's return to Taibugid. Their power also had its limits. In the 15th century, Abulkhair Khan of the Uzbeks, a descendant of Genghis Khan, came onto the historical stage. His power covered the Dashti Kipchak, and his influence extended far beyond the current borders of Kazakhstan. The Taibugids found themselves under his pressure. Formally, they maintained independence, but from time to time, they acknowledged dependence on Abulkhair. This gave them protection, but undermined their authority, since a Chinggisid always had more legitimacy than the local dynasty. Even in these conditions, the Taibugids kept control of Siberia. They remained in Isker, collected tribute, and maintained an independent policy, not joining Abulkhair's uluses. This became possible thanks to the support of local clans and constant maneuvering between the steppe powers. By the 15th century, Siberia had become an independent center. The Taibugids ruled the rich Irtysh and Oblands, collected tribute and traded actively. Their policy was based on both alliance and rivalry with Kazan. Sometimes they formed alliances against common enemies, and sometimes they quarreled over border ulysses. There were close ties with the Nogai horde through marriages and joint military campaigns, but also constant competition for control over the steppe routes. Trade caravans from Bukhara and Khiva traveled to Siberia through the steppes. The Taibugids knew how to make a profit, but they also faced pressure from the Bukhara Khans, who sought to subjugate their northern neighbors. We should remember the struggle over the Golden Horde's legacy. After the old state broke apart, each piece claimed to be the main successor. The Siberian Khanate made itself known by joining coalitions, supporting some Chinggisids over others, and fielding tens of thousands of horsemen in campaigns. The Siberian cavalry was famous among neighbors for being light, fast, and armed with bows and spears, able to travel far and strike quickly. In addition, the Khanate attracted allied detachments from conquered tribes and mercenaries, all of which made it a serious military force in the region. The Siberian Khanate was not a monolithic state with a clear dynasty like, for example, the Ottoman Empire or the Moscow Principality. Here, power was held by a clan, and not even by just one. As mentioned, the Taibugid clan was central, but Shiban's descendants, Jochi's younger son, and direct Chinggisids also claimed power. That is why the Khan's power in Siberia was always fragile. Jochid line contenders had the formal right to challenge the throne from the Taibugid clan, leading to occasional struggles. The Taibugid clan couldn't formally use the title Khan, as it was reserved for Chinggis Khan's descendants. However, after the Golden Horde collapsed, this rule became less strict. There was no strong Chinggisid clan in Siberia, and the Taibugids became the actual rulers. They were hereditary lords who later adopted the Khan title. But here, the Khan was not only a ruler, but also a kind of coordinator of diverse forces. His power depended on how well he could maintain the balance between the nomadic Tatars of the steppe, the settled Ugro-Siberian tribes in the forests, and the detachments of the military nobility. The Khan formally held supreme power, collecting tribute, deciding on war and peace, and appointing commanders. But in reality, each of his initiatives required the consent of the clan aristocracy and the support of influential beys and mirs. This system made the Khan's rule more collective, with the council of elders and military nobility playing roles equal to the Khan's. The decision about a campaign or an alliance was not made alone, but through discussion. If the Khan lost respect or was defeated in an important battle, he could quickly be replaced by a more successful contender. As a result, the Khanate often saw frequent power shifts. Some Khans ruled for decades, while others lasted less than a year. Despite this, the Siberian Khanate stayed stable because it didn't rely on one person. Its system let it endure weak rulers and wait for strong ones, maintaining the Khanate's unity. The Siberian Khanate was not homogeneous. It was inhabited by different peoples, and this is what made it unique. In the cities and fortresses lived the Tatars, descendants of the Kipchaks and Mangits who had converted to Islam and inherited the traditions of the Golden Horde. They formed the core of the nobility and the military elite of the Khanate. Tribes roamed the steppes who were culturally and linguistically similar to the Tatars, but less connected to cities. But the Khanate was not limited to just the steppe dwellers. It also included the forest peoples, the Khanti, Mansi, Selkups, and Ostiaks. They followed their own customs, lived by hunting and fishing, and collected furs valued across Eurasia. Siberian rulers collected yasak, a fur tribute, making the forest tribes part of their system. Thus, the steppe and the taiga were united in one state. Some provided warriors, others the riches of nature. Culturally, the Khanate was also dual in nature. In capitals like Kishlak, Islam prevailed, with mosques, writings in the Turkic language, and Sufi sheikhs who taught the law and rituals. But deep within the Khanate, old beliefs persisted. Shamans lit bonfires, made offerings to the spirits of water and forest, and honored their ancestors. This coexistence did not seem strange. The Khan could be a patron of Islam, while next to him, a warrior or hunter might turn to a shaman. An ordinary person's life was shaped more by nature's rhythm than by the palace or laws. Summer, nomadic camps, hunting, trading at fairs. Winter, yurts or log cabins, livestock, crafts. The economy was based on nomadic livestock breeding and yasak, with trade linking the Khanate to Moscow, Bukhara, and Khiva. Furs were exported south and west, while fabrics, iron, and grain were imported. This blend, the nomadic Turkic world and the forest hunting world, was the unique feature of the Siberian Khanate. It connected two worlds, two ways of life, and two belief systems. That is why Siberia at that time was perceived as a special land, a borderland, and at the same time independent. By the late 15th century, Ibak, a descendant of Shiban from Abulkar's line, took power in Siberia. He used local nobility's power to oust the Taibugids and became the Khanate's true ruler. Ibak proved himself as both a warrior and politician, joining the Chingizid struggle. His campaigns reached the Urals and Volga region, making his name known well beyond Siberia. The Taibugids rebelled, killed Ibak, and reclaimed the throne. A prominent representative of their dynasty was Zhadiger. Unlike the outsider Chingizid, he relied on the old local tradition and sought to restore the authority of his own line. The first diplomatic contacts with Moscow began under Zhadiger. The Siberian princes understood that a new strong state was rising in the west and would eventually become an important partner or adversary. The embassy to Moscow and back laid the foundation for future relations. The Siberian princes could act as allies of Ivan Grozny, especially when it came to fighting against Kazan or the Nogais. They sometimes accepted vassal status with Moscow to get weapons and goods, offering military help in return. However, this was a practical alliance, not true subordination. The Khanate still remained independent, although it was gradually drawn into the orbit of the Moscow state. However, Zhadiger's power was too unstable. His own Ulisses were drifting away. Some clans were oriented toward Moscow, while others sought support in the Nogai steppe. But most importantly, he did not have Chingizid ancestry, which was always a vulnerability in the steppe world. No matter how strong the tradition of Taibuga was, without sacred blood, power was considered temporary. And so, in the middle of the 16th century, a man who possessed such blood came to Siberia. His name was Kuchum, the grandson of that very Ibak who had previously been overthrown by the Taibugids. He was a direct Chingizid and therefore possessed what the Taibugids lacked, the right to the Khan's title. By origin, Kuchum did not come alone. Allied clans stood with him, armed detachments and Islamic scholars were ready to support the new Khan. Zhadiger couldn't survive the power struggle. He fell, ending the era of the Taibugi. After the old dynasty fell, the new Khan Kuchum rose, made Iskar, Kashlik, his capital, and turned the Siberian Khanate into a stage for fresh ambitions. It is with him that the final chapter of the Khanate's history begins, the clash with Moscow, Islamization, and the tragic finale. Kuchum turned out to be a ruler of a special kind. His power was built on strictness and religious reform. He actively promoted Islam, invited mullahs and Sufis from Central Asia, and destroyed pagan shrines. For many, this became a sign of a new era. The Khanate was no longer just a border steppe. It was trying to become part of the Islamic world. At the same time, this caused internal discontent among those Khans for whom shamanistic traditions remained familiar. On the external stage, Kuchum pursued an aggressive policy, expanding the Khanate north and east, annexing the Tumen Khanate, subjugating tribes, and collecting yasak from them. These furs became the main source of wealth for the Khanate. Trade with Bukhara and Central Asian merchants brought silver, fabrics, and weapons. Thus, Siberia was turning into an important element of the transcontinental fur belt economy, which stretched from the Arctic to the markets of Iran and Turkey. Kuchum realized the main threat was from the west, specifically Moscow. Russian voivodes advanced step by step beyond the Urals, built forts, and collected yasak from the tribes. The Khan tried to stop this process, sent raids to the border regions, and looked for allies. At times, he managed to win victories, but the forces were unequal. Moscow had far more resources, and its advance was systematic. Nevertheless, it was under Kuchum that the Khanate reached its greatest power and became known beyond the Urals. The Khan was seen as an independent ruler respected by both Moscow and Central Asia, but his reign also signaled the beginning of the end. Constant wars, forced Islamization, tribal conflicts, and rising Russian influence gradually weakened the Khanate's stability. The history of the Siberian Khanate is often summed up by the name Yermak, but this is a myth from later legends. In reality, it was more complex. In 1581, Ataman Yermak Timofeyevich led a Cossack detachment to Siberia. But they were not free knights of the steppe, as people like to write. The Cossacks acted as mercenaries. They were hired by the Stroganov merchants, who needed new lands and new resources. According to legend, Yermak brought thousands of men with him and defeated an entire Khanate. It was actually a series of skirmishes, negotiations, and local clans joining the Cossacks by switching sides. Yermak's warriors numbered from a few hundred up to 1,500. Kuchum had more people, but his ulusses were scattered, and he couldn't gather everyone under one banner. The decisive battle was at Chuvash Cape in 1582. Yermak's Cossacks used firearms, muskets, and cannons, which the Nogais and Tatars in those lands hardly had. This broke Kuchum's cavalry formation, his troops fled, and the Khan escaped. The Cossacks entered Iskar, the Khanate's capital, but holding it was harder than taking it. Yermak was surrounded by hostile ulusses, still willing and able to fight, facing constant raids, skirmishes, and food shortages. At that time, there was no legend of conquered Siberia. In fact, everything was uncertain. He gathered his forces and in August 1585 launched a counterattack during a night assault. His men killed almost all of Yermak's detachment, and the ataman himself died. According to legend, he drowned in the Irtysh River, weighed down by the heavy armor that the Tsar had once given him. The Khanate appeared saved. The news of Yermak's death spread throughout Siberia and gave Kuchum's supporters hope. After Yermak's death, it was as if Kuchum got a second wind. He regrouped his supporters, formed alliances with some Nogai and Bukhara clans, and attempted to retake the Irtysh. For years, he attacked Moscow garrisons, raided forts, retreated to the steppes, and returned. But things changed. Systematic expansion replaced scattered Cossack units, and Moscow gradually strengthened its position. Tyumen was founded in 1586, followed a few years later by Tobolsk, which became the main Russian stronghold in Siberia. Following the military forts came peasants, monks, and merchants. An important blow to the traditional order was the acceptance of Said Ahmed in 1588. This prince from the Taibugid dynasty embodied the old legitimacy of the Khanate. When he arrived in Moscow, it was clear the Taibugids would never regain power, and from then on their line faded away. Resistance to Kuchum continued for more than 10 years, but after the defeat in the 1590s, his ulusses began to dwindle. Kuchum fled south into the Central Asian steppes seeking allies, but lacked the strength to continue. In 1598, he suffered a final defeat and disappeared from the political scene. The Siberian Khanate ceased to exist as an independent state. In its place, a new reality emerged: fortresses, settlement lines, and administrative districts. Initially, everything was maintained by military force, but over time, colonization also began. By early 17th century, Siberia was firmly part of the Moscow state. The Siberian Khanate was the Golden Horde's last major remnant in the east. It emerged from local traditions and the Taibugid dynasties, uniting nomadic and settled lands, and set policies with Moscow, Kazan, and Bukhara. But, like many states of the steppe, it proved vulnerable to external pressure and internal strife. The history of the Khanate is not just a story of wars and conquests. It's a story about the transition from the nomadic world to the world of settled empires within a single generation. The steppe, where yurts and herds had ruled for centuries, turned into a land of fortresses, outposts, and farming villages. With the fall of the Siberian Khanate, the era of independent Turkic states in western Siberia came to an end. But its memory lived on in legends, in stories about Kuchum and his descendants. And today it reminds us of how complex and multi-layered the path of these lands to a new era was. That's all from me. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye everyone.